Still using primitive weapons?
Primitive, maybe. But we survived.
Your technology cannot defeat us.
Technology is not strength.
Then prove it. Humanity did this?
You never understood us. We survive.
They called us primitive. That word got thrown around a lot in the early years of galactic contact primitive, usually by species who had spent the last few millennia doing their killing from a safe distance, wrapped in force fields and firing weapons that looked more like art installations than tools of war. They'd look at our rifles, our artillery, our drop pods, and they'd get this expression. Like watching a child try to explain something complicated with the wrong words. Patient, indulgent, quietly horrified. The Velhorians were the worst of them. They had 3,000 years of uninterrupted civilization behind them, 3,000 years of philosophical refinement, of architectural achievement, of elegantly conducted warfare that left no mud on anyone's boots and no permanent scars on the land. They settled disputes with orbital surgical strikes and hard-light field projections. Their soldiers didn't bleed. Their weapons didn't make noise. Everything about the way they approached conflict was clean, controlled, and, if you were being honest about it, profoundly removed from the reality of what killing actually is. So when the Terran Empire requested a mutual defense pact and sent a diplomatic envoy to the Velhorian capital world of Vel-Oris, the reception was exactly what you'd expect. They laughed. Ambassador Daniel Kessler had been in the diplomat corps for 22 years. He had sat across negotiating tables from species that communicated through color shifts, species that registered emotion as barometric pressure, and one particularly exhausting civilization that expressed disagreement by going completely silent for 72 hours. He had developed, over those years, a very specific kind of patience, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and still, while everything around it moves. He needed every ounce of it today. The Grand Conclave Hall of Vel-Oris was not built for human proportions. It was built for spectacle. Tiers of spectator galleries curved upward and outward from a central stage like the inside of a seashell, each platform suspended at a slightly different altitude by repulsor fields that made no sound. The stone was a pale iridescent white, not marble, not quartz. Something the Velhorians had developed themselves that caught light in 3 directions at once and turned it into something that looked almost alive. The air smelled faintly of something between ozone and rain, maintained at a precise temperature that the Velhorians considered optimal and that Kessler found mildly suffocating. He sat in the diplomatic enclosure on the second tier, jacket buttoned, back straight, watching the holographic projection that filled the center of the hall. It was footage from the siege of Durin Station, 2 years old, pulled from combat drone recordings, Terran infantry in full ablative gear working through a collapsed urban block, rifles up, moving through smoke and debris with the kind of focused, ugly efficiency that only comes from people who have done this before and expect to have to do it again. The audio was intact. Gunfire, artillery percussion, the distant compression of an airstrike. It was loud and it was brutal and it was, objectively, not a pleasant thing to watch. The Velhorian court found it absolutely hilarious. The dominant mood in the gallery readable in the shifting bioluminescent undertones of their garments, which apparently responded to emotional state, was a particular shade of cool violet. Amused, superior. The laughter wasn't cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who genuinely couldn't believe what they were seeing. The way you might laugh at something so far outside your frame of reference that your brain doesn't know how else to process it. Extraordinary, Princess Seraphine said. She sat on the elevated dais at the far end of the hall, elevated slightly above the diplomatic tier, which was itself elevated above the common gallery, which was elevated above the floor. Everything about Velhorian architecture communicated hierarchy without ever having to say it out loud. The princess herself was the kind of striking that cuts across species' pale skin that held a faint internal luminescence, hair the color of deep water, 6 fingers on each hand that rested with practiced stillness on the arms of her throne. She had the quality of someone who had never once been surprised by anything, because nothing had ever surprised her. You genuinely ignite a chemical compound inside a metal cylinder, she said, to accelerate a smaller piece of metal toward a target. We do, Kessler said. His voice stayed level. It always stayed level. And you call this, she paused, letting the word form with deliberate care, ballistics, among other things. She smiled. It was a technically flawless smile. Warm in shape and temperature in absolutely nothing else. It's almost endearing, Ambassador. Like watching someone discover that rubbing sticks together produces heat and deciding that's sufficient for the task. She gestured toward the frozen hologram with 2 fingers. A Terran soldier hung suspended mid-stride, spent casings orbiting his rifle in a little arc of brass. Your empire is asking us for a military partnership. You are presenting these men these weapons as an equivalent contribution to a joint defense arrangement. I'm presenting them as a complimentary one, Kessler said. She tilted her head slightly. The way someone does when they've already decided the answer, but are willing to let the other person finish speaking out of courtesy. The Velhorian Ascendancy operates hard-light refraction fields at the infantry level. Our armor does not deflect energy, it mathematically disperses it, redistributing impact across a quantum barrier that functions independently of any physical medium. A particle traveling at any velocity cannot break a quantum barrier. Ambassador, this is not a design achievement. It is physics. Physics. Kessler agreed. Absolutely. So you understand why we find the idea of another careful pause chemical propellant weapons as a military contribution somewhat difficult to take seriously. More laughter from the gallery. Light. Polite. The sound of people sharing a joke they've all already heard but still find funny. Kessler let it run for a moment. He had learned, over 22 years, that there was a specific kind of silence that comes right after laughter. A brief window where people are relaxed, a little self-satisfied, not paying full attention. He'd found it useful. Energy dissipates, he said, when the sound had faded enough. Plasma cools. Hard light fields need a power source. Quantum barriers need something to anchor them. He kept his hands flat on the table, unhurried. But mass doesn't have an off switch. A 2-ton object moving at Mach 5 doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't have a charge cycle. It doesn't care about electromagnetic interference. Ambassador, the smile again. Patient and bright as a lamp in a room where the door has been closed. You are describing rocks. In essence, we have shields that have repelled sustained plasma artillery bombardment. The mathematics are not in dispute. No, Kessler said. He reached into his briefcase, actual leather, worn at the corners, because he'd found that every single alien species he'd ever dealt with paid more attention when you brought something physical into a room and set a heavy brass cylinder on the glass table. Comm beacon. Secure. Which is why the Terran High Command thought a hologram would be insufficient. Seraphine straightened almost imperceptibly. You brought a demonstration. We brought a Marine. He pressed the top of the cylinder. A red light blinked twice, then held steady green. He's currently in low orbit. He'll be joining us in a few minutes. In a shuttle. We don't use shuttles for combat deployments. Shuttles have engine signatures. They can be targeted. Kessler picked up his tea synthetic, terrible, and took a sip. We use a different method. She looked up at the transparent dome of the ceiling. The sky above was a clear afternoon blue, still and unmarked. I see no approach vector. No, Kessler said. You wouldn't. 200 meters above the hall, inside what the engineering specification sheets called a Mark-Fix orbital insertion pod, and what everyone who'd ever climbed into one called a coffin. Staff Sergeant Marcus Vane was chewing gum and watching the countdown. T-minus 18 seconds. The pod was not comfortable. It was not designed to be. It was roughly the size of a wardrobe, constructed from ablative titanium, and shaped in the general way of a blunt arrowhead, broad and dense at the front, tapered at the rear. No windows. No view. The interior smelled like hydraulic fluid and his own sweat, and the faint chemical undertone of the synthetic gum he'd been chewing since they cleared the thermosphere. The crash harness was cinched tight across his chest. His armor. A full set of Mark IV ablative combat plate matte gray. 360 kilograms with full loadout. Scarred from previous work, took up most of the remaining space. He'd done this 14 times. He didn't love it. Nobody loved it. The Marines who said they loved it were the ones you watched carefully in a firefight. Because people who genuinely enjoyed this particular experience had a relationship with their own survival that made them unpredictable. He loved the part after. Command, this is Vane. Telemetry is green. Gravity reads 0.97 Earth standard. His voice in the encrypted channel was unhurried. The kind of calm that isn't performed but just lived in. Built over years of situations where panicking used up energy you needed for something else. Wind shear looks manageable. Copy, Sergeant. Target is the central stage of the Grand Conclave Hall. Vel Oris Capital. You are cleared for hard deck. Make it visible. Always do. T-5. He closed his eyes. Not from fear. just to center himself to feel the weight of the suit, the vibration of the pod's internal systems, the last few seconds of stillness before everything became noise and motion. He'd developed the habit early in his career and kept it the way you keep any ritual that works. Not superstition, just a way of being present. Zero. The explosive bolts fired and the bottom dropped out of the world. For about 2 seconds it was free fall, pure, silent, the absence of everything. Then the upper atmosphere caught him and the silence ended. The pod hit the air column like a fist through wet paper. The temperature gauge on his HUD went from ambient to 1400 degrees in under 3 seconds as friction ionized the air around the titanium shell, turning the whole thing into a man-made comet. The sound was indescribable from the inside, a sustained roar that was less a noise than a physical condition, like being inside the resonance of a very large bell. His teeth clicked together despite the mouthguard. The G-forces built slowly, then all at once, pressing the breath out of his chest with the patient efficiency of something that had been doing this to human bodies since the species first figured out that height had consequences. He didn't fight it. You couldn't fight it. You breathed in the gaps between the worst of it and let your body do what it was reinforced to do. The Velhorians, he'd been briefed, descended to planetary surfaces in vessels with smooth repulsor fields, silent and precise as elevators. No heat, no noise, no mess. He wasn't going to pretend that didn't have appeal, but you couldn't jam a rock falling from the sky. You couldn't confuse it with electronic warfare. You couldn't talk it into changing course. 3 miles of kinetic potential. And the only way to stop it was to be in the way. That was the point. At 3,000 feet, the retrothrusters fired. The deceleration was violent enough to put White in his vision for about half a second. The inertial dampeners taking the main load while his modified physiology handled the rest. His heart rate monitor ticked up to 160, then began coming down. The targeting display on his HUD painted the courtyard below, center stage. He could see the heat bloom of the atmospheric disturbance he'd created, the displaced air spreading outward from his entry vector in visible waves. Hard deck in 4 seconds. He gripped the harness and let go. Princess Seraphine heard it before she saw it. Everyone did. It started as something at the edge of perception, a low vibration, almost subsonic, that you felt in your sternum before your ears registered it as sound. Then it grew, rapidly and without any of the gradual buildup that suggested distance. It was simply there. And then it was louder. And then it was everything. A tearing, descending shriek that made the floating gallery platforms shudder on their repulsor mounts and sent several court attendants stumbling back from the railing. Seraphine stood up from her throne. Through the transparent dome, a streak of fire split the sky. Not a ship. No running lights. No stabilization systems. No engine signature that the hall's automated defense grids could latch onto. Just a superheated column of compressed air wrapped around a dense object moving very fast. Ambassador. What? Physics, Kessler said. He'd gripped the edge of the table. She noticed. But his voice hadn't changed. Your Highness, you may want to hold on to something. The pod hit the center of the courtyard. The sound arrived a fraction of a second after the impact, a compressed crack that wasn't quite an explosion. More like the air itself flinching. The kinetic energy of the landing transferred outward through the stone floor in a ripple, and the floor was not equal to the task. The pale, iridescent surface that had stood for 600 years shattered outward from the impact point like thin ice under a boot, and the shockwave, compressed air and powdered stone and the disoriented momentum of 300 kilos of mass at terminal velocity hit the lower gallery like a wall. Tapestries tore free from their mountings. Court attendants dropped to the floor, knocked off their feet or simply falling in shock. The smell of lavender that the climate systems had maintained for as long as anyone could remember was gone, replaced in an instant by scorched metal and pulverized mineral, and something sharp and chemical that had no natural equivalent on this world. Then silence. The real silence. The kind that comes after a very loud sound, when your ears are still processing what happened and the dust is still moving. Seraphine stood at the edge of her dais, her hands at her sides, looking at the crater in the center of her hall. It was not a small crater. It was roughly 4 meters across and deep enough that she couldn't see the bottom through the settling haze. Barbarians, she said quietly. Not an insult. Exactly, more of a diagnosis. The pod hissed. Steam vented from seals along its sides, white and sharp-smelling. Then, with a sound like a mechanism solving a problem it had been thinking about for a while, the blast door at the front of the pod blew outward, not opened. Blue, a single decisive impact that sent the heavy panel spinning through the air until it hit a marble pillar hard enough to embed itself 6 inches deep. Boots on stone, heavy, rhythmic, each step leaving a shallow impression in the cracked courtyard surface. Marcus Vane climbed out of the crater. He was not what the hall had expected. The Velhorian court had seen military figures before their own guards were tall, elegant, their armor designed with the same aesthetic philosophy as everything else in the hall, beautiful and precise. What climbed out of that smoking hole in the floor was something different. The armor was matte, gray, and deeply scarred. Not from neglect, but from actual use. The kind that leaves real marks. Gouge lines across the shoulder. Pauldrons told stories she couldn't read but could infer. Paint stripped back to bare steel in patches. The proportions were massive in the way that functional things sometimes are not designed for aesthetics, designed for task completion. And the task was violence. He carried a heavy magnetic rail weapon slung across his back. In his hands he held a pump-action shotgun that, she would later learn, had a design lineage stretching back over 4 centuries. He walked to the center of the ruined stage. He planted his feet. He looked up at the royal dais, and the polarized visor of his helmet gave back nothing but a flat mirror surface. No expression, no adjustment, no acknowledgement of the difference in their social stations. He did not bow. He racked the slide of the shotgun. The mechanical sound heavy, deliberate, entirely analog echoed across the stunned quiet of the hall. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Vane," he said, his voice through the external speaker flat and carrying and without ceremony, reporting for the demonstration. In the diplomatic enclosure, Kessler allowed himself the very small, very private satisfaction of watching the court's dominant color shift from amused violet to something considerably less settled. The joke, it seemed, was over. The Taurian-class combat drone was, objectively, an impressive piece of engineering. It rose from a blast door in the courtyard floor on a repulsor lift, ascending smoothly and without noise to its operational height of roughly 3 meters. The body was arachnid in configuration, 8 articulated legs arranged around a central chassis of polished chrome and dark impact glass, each limb ending in a gripping claw that could anchor to most surfaces or function as a close-quarters weapon, depending on the situation. It had no face, no cockpit, no pilot, just sensors and weapon systems and the capacity to make very fast, very bad decisions about nearby organic matter. It weighed. Vane's targeting system informed him. Approximately 4 tons. When it locked into position at the center of the ruined courtyard, the hard light shields came up. 4 of them. Hexagonal, translucent blue-white, snapping into place with a low resonant hum that he felt in his back molars. They overlapped at the edges and merged into a seamless dome around the drone's body, not a physical barrier, not a wall of any material, but a continuously recalculating quantum field that would take any incoming energy or mass and mathematically redistribute it across the field's surface. The Velhorians had spent about 4 centuries refining the design. It was, by every honest metric, extraordinary technology. The Taurian unit is equipped with a Class 4 refractive shield, Princess Seraphine said from above. Her composure had reassembled itself with impressive speed after the drop pod impact. The shock smoothed back beneath the practiced surface of someone who had spent a lifetime in public. Only the faint displacement of her normal stillness, a slight forward lean. Hands no longer quite as relaxed on the throne's armrests, suggested that the last 3 minutes had affected her at all. Rated to absorb direct plasma artillery at sustained output. You may fire at your convenience. Sergeant. Vane didn't respond. He was already moving. He holstered the shotgun, reached back with both hands and unslung the MA9 mass driver from his back, a portable magnetic rail system, roughly the length of his torso, that used his suit's reactor as a power source. It was not a graceful weapon. There was nothing elegant about it. It was a machine designed to accelerate a dense metal slug to a velocity where the physics of impact became largely academic, and it looked exactly like what it was, a tool built for a specific, brutal purpose by people who weren't interested in how it looked while it worked. He planted his feet, engaged the magnetic brace that locked the weapon to his shoulder armor, checked his targeting overlay range, windage, nothing particularly complicated at this distance, and aimed. He didn't aim at the shield. He aimed at the center of the drone's chassis, mass, not the barrier around it. Firing, he said. The MA9 didn't fire the way chemical weapons fired. There was no crack, no visible flash. What happened was more like a controlled catastrophe. The magnetic coils spun up in a fraction of a second, pulling a massive current from the suit reactor, and the electromagnetic field built to a point where the air around the barrel visibly distorted. bending light the way heat does over summer asphalt. Then the coil released, all at once, and the 15-millimeter depleted uranium slug left the barrel at somewhere north of Mach 8. The sound arrived as a physical blow, not the sharp percussion of a chemical gun, but something more total, a displacement, a compression of air that hit the chest like a flat hand. The remaining unbroken glass in the lower galleries shattered simultaneously. Several court attendants covered their ears too late and stood with their hands pressed against their heads, looking stunned. The slug crossed the distance between Vane and the drone in less time than a blink. It hit the hardlight shield dead center. Seraphine's breath came out in something that might have been relief. The shield flared a sunspot pulse of white so bright that it left an afterimage on every eye in the hall and held. The slug flattened and vaporized on contact. Its mass converted to heat and dispersed across the field's surface, exactly as the mathematics said it would be. The drone itself sat perfectly still behind its glowing barrier, entirely unaffected. Its sensor clusters tracking Vane with the patient attention of something that doesn't get tired. The gallery exhaled. The bioluminescent undertone of the court's garments shifted back toward violet, that particular shade of confirmed expectations and quiet satisfaction. As I indicated, Seraphine said, there was no cruelty in it, just the tone of someone confirming a result they'd already calculated. The mathematics are not. Look at the floor, Kessler said. She turned. The drone had moved, not by much, 3 feet, maybe slightly more, dragged backward across the pristine courtyard surface in a single instant of contact. The evidence was clear and ugly, deep parallel gouges in the stone where the drone's anchoring claws had scrambled for purchase and failed. Scratch marks that ran in 4 distinct lines back from where the drone had been standing to where it now stood. The chrome chassis fractionally tilted, its internal gyroscopes cycling audibly as they worked to re-establish level. The shield had held perfectly. The math was intact. But the math hadn't accounted for what happened to the physical thing inside the math when you hit it with a freight train's worth of kinetic energy and told it to stay in one place. Vane racked the charging handle. Second shot, he said. No preamble. The coil shrieked again. Same point of impact. Same result, the shield flared. The slug ceased to exist. The barrier held without a scratch. But the drone staggered, visibly staggered, its rear legs buckling under the transferred momentum. The heavy chassis rocking like something trying to stay upright in a current it hadn't expected. The gyros were louder now. In the diplomatic enclosure, Kessler stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The hall was quiet enough. Terran doctrine, Your Highness, is straightforward. We don't need to defeat your shields. We need to defeat the object your shields are attached to. He let that sit for a moment. Force equals mass times acceleration. Your barrier can disperse energy. It cannot disperse momentum. And momentum, he said, watching the drone fight to maintain its footing, has to go somewhere. Third shot. This time the rear left actuator gave out entirely a sharp metallic crack, loud enough to carry across the hall. As the structural joint failed under the accumulated stress of 3 consecutive kinetic impacts and the Newtonian reaction that the barrier's designers hadn't built to absorb, the drone went down sideways. Hard, 4 tons of chrome and sensor arrays crashing onto the ruined stone with a sound like a building falling. Its shield stayed on, glowing perfectly, functioning exactly as intended, wrapped around a machine that was now lying on its side, unable to move. Vane lowered the weapon. Shield held, he said. Target neutralized. The hall was very quiet. Seraphine stared at the downed drone for a long moment. She had the expression of someone who has just watched their most fundamental assumption about how something works get quietly, methodically dismantled. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even fully shock. It was the particular disorientation of a person who realizes they had been asking the wrong question for a very long time. Kessler opened his mouth to follow up. That was when the alarm went off. It wasn't a gentle alarm. Nothing about the next 30 seconds was gentle. The warning tone cut through the hall at a pitch and volume that suggested the system had been designed by people who understood that subtlety. In genuine emergencies, was a liability. The ambient lighting, warm, diffuse, calibrated for comfort, snapped to emergency red without transition. The gallery platform shuddered as the automated defense grid came online and began querying for a threat it couldn't find, because what came through the dome didn't have an engine signature or an electronic profile. What came through the dome was a concentrated thermal lance, a directed energy tool used for mining and construction and, as it turned out, for cutting through architectural domes from the outside when you needed a fast entry point. The transparent ceiling of the Grand Conclave Hall ruptured, not explosively. It peeled. A long, curved section of the dome, folding inward and falling in large pieces that struck the upper gallery tiers and shattered against the repulsor platforms, sending shards of material raining down onto the lower levels. Through the opening, against the afternoon sky, a black gunship descended. It was not a Valhorian design. The lines were wrong, too angular, too aggressive. Built without any of the flowing aesthetic sensibility that characterized Valhorian engineering. It was a separatist configuration, Kalen built, designed for rapid assault in contested environments. The hull was matte black, and the running lights were off, and the side doors were already open before it cleared the hole in the dome. One of the royal guards identified it first, Kalen separatists. He didn't finish the sentence. The separatists didn't use kinetic weapons. They used particle beam emitters, tuned specifically to bypass the resonance frequency of standard Valhorian ceremonial armor designed for court appearances and crowd management, not for actual combat. The beams hit the first two guards before anyone in the gallery had finished processing that the attack had begun. The results were not clean. Energy weapons at sustained output against targets not designed to handle them are not clean. Two guards were down before the screaming started, and the screaming started before anyone knew where to run. The gallery erupted. 3,000 years of civilized peace had produced a court that was extraordinarily cultured and entirely useless in a crisis. Silk and reactive polymer in every panicked shade of yellow and white surged toward the exits in a mob that couldn't agree on a direction. The floating platforms shuddered as people grabbed railings. Someone fell. Vane was already moving. He'd had the threat assessed within the first 2 seconds of the alarm gunship. Hostile, active fire. Multiple contacts fast roping from the fuselage to the courtyard. His tactical overlay tagged them automatically. 6 visible, more potentially in the hold. Armed with beam weapons, personal hardlight shields active. Moving in the synchronized pattern of people who had trained together and expected this to be straightforward. They were not expecting him. He wasn't at the center of the courtyard. He was at the edge, close to the diplomatic enclosure. Close to where Seraphine had descended from the dais to get a better look at the drone demonstration, a minor procedural thing that was now the difference between her being in the open and being behind cover. She was standing at the base of the dais steps when the first shot scorched the marble 2 feet to her left. She froze. The separatist who'd fired was adjusting his aim for the second shot when Vane hit him. Not with a weapon, with his body. 360 kilograms of armored marine at a dead sprint doesn't leave much room for nuance. He hit the separatist at shoulder height, and the man went into the marble pillar behind him with enough force to end the immediate problem of him. Vane didn't stop. He pivoted, put himself between Seraphine and the gunship's open side door, and took the next beam discharge full in the chest plate. The ablative armor did its job. The ceramic tungsten composite outer layer vaporized in layers, burning away and shedding the thermal load before it could reach the internal systems. It hurt the heat transferred through even with the dissipation, baking the interior of the suit to a temperature that triggered the thermal warning system, and the pressure of the sustained beam pushed him back half a step. Smoke poured from his chest in thick white streams. The separatist, firing, stared. He had a weapon that had been specifically selected for its ability to punch through Valhorian military-grade shields with 2 or 3 seconds of sustained contact. The Terran had just absorbed a full burst and was still on his feet. "My turn," Vane said. He dropped the mass driver. Too long, too slow for this distance and these angles. His hand found the shotgun at his hip in a motion that had been done so many times it wasn't a thought anymore. Just a sequence. Like breathing, he brought it up from the hip, not the shoulder. Because at 8 meters you don't need precise aim. You need mass distribution. The separatist's personal hardlight shield was active and bright. It would stop a plasma bolt or a laser or anything that delivered its energy as a focused point. What it experienced instead was 9 lead pellets arriving simultaneously across a spread pattern, each one delivering its kinetic contribution to the same surface at the same instant. The shield held it, absorbed the impact, and redistributed it as designed. But the man behind the shield weighed about 80 kilograms and had 2 feet on the floor, and nothing behind him except 6 feet of open air before a marble pillar. The kinetic transfer lifted him off his feet. His back hit the pillar, and his neck snapped with a sound that was audible even over the general noise of the unfolding chaos. Vane pumped the slide, turned back to Seraphine. "Stay low," he said. The external speaker made his voice flat and mechanical. "Get to the back of the dais. Do not stand up. Do not use your personal shield. I need to be able to see you. She was looking at the dead separatist with an expression he couldn't read through the visor. He didn't have time to try. Your Highness. Sharper now. Move. She moved. Above them. The gunship was repositioning. The two remaining doors had disgorged their complement 6 separatist troopers. Hardlight shields up. Moving toward the center of the courtyard in a disciplined formation that suggested they'd done this kind of thing before. They were good. Professionally good. Probably ex-military. Possibly current somewhere in the separatist command structure. They moved with the careful precision of people who expected to win and were being thorough about it. Vane put a fragmentary grenade in their direction. An M67 is not a sophisticated weapon. It is a small cylinder of Composition B explosive wrapped in a serrated steel wire jacket. And when the Composition B detonates, the wire jacket becomes approximately 650 fragments traveling outward in all directions at roughly 1,000 meters per second. The Volhorian court had nothing like it. The Separatists had hardlight shields capable of stopping most energy weapons and calibrated for high-velocity solid projectiles. They were not calibrated for overpressure. The detonation waved the raw atmospheric compression of the explosion. The air itself turned briefly into a weapon punched through the hardlight barriers, the way water goes through a screen. It doesn't interact with the field at the molecular level that the barriers were designed to handle. It interacts with everything inside the field, including the occupant's inner ear, sinuses, and the fluid-filled chambers that keep a brain from rattling against the inside of its skull. 3 separatists dropped, instantly, simultaneously, blood at the seal margins of their helmets. The remaining 3 staggered. Shields still glowing, but their formation broken and their timing gone. One turned toward the noise. One dropped to a knee and began firing in an arc. Indiscriminate. Thermal discharge cutting across the courtyard in a sweeping line that burned through the base of 2 floating platforms and sent them crashing down into the lower gallery. Vane was already through them. He came around the edge of a fallen decorative column and put the first one down with a slug, the kinetic transfer, at close range breaking something in the man's spine before he hit the ground. He pumped the slide and fired at the second without breaking stride. The buckshot impact, sending the man skidding backward and folding at the knees. The third had his weapon up and tracking, and Vane ate a partial beam hit on the left pauldron. He felt the joint temperature spike, heard the servo warning, and fired anyway. Miss. He closed the distance and used the butt of the shotgun instead. The last separatist from that group went down and stayed down, across the hall, through the noise and the emergency lighting and the drifting smoke from the burning tapestries. Kessler was doing something Vane hadn't expected from a diplomat. He wasn't hiding. He'd shed his jacket and was moving through the gallery in a low crouch, physically pulling Volhorian court members away from the open areas toward the structural columns at the halls as edges, the ones built from solid material rather than suspended on repulsors, the ones that would still be standing if the ceiling came down. He was barking directions in clipped, clear sentences, and even in the chaos, people were following them, because he spoke with the tone of someone who had made a decision and wasn't revising it. Ambassador status. Vane called on the comm. Lower galleries are clear of hostiles. Kessler's voice came back slightly strained. The first sign of effort he'd heard from the man all day. I've got 30 or so civilians behind structural cover. Blast doors on the south exit aren't responding. Gunship's EW suite is blocking the override codes. We're contained. Vane processed that. The gunship. Yes, he looked up at it. The black hull was turning slowly on its repulsor lifts. The side doors now closed. The forward sensor cluster orienting toward him. He'd been tagged as the primary threat. That was fine. What wasn't fine was the weapon system deploying from the underslung hardpoint a heavy plasma cannon, the kind designed for sustained suppression against fortified positions. Its emitter already beginning to cycle toward operational temperature, the air around it wavering with the heat. That weapon didn't discriminate. At full charge, it would sterilize everything in the courtyard. Shields, armor, stone, organic matter, all of it. Vane looked at his ammunition counter. 3 shells. He looked at the gunship. He looked at the courtyard, at the debris, the craters, the fallen platforms, and then upward, past the gunship, to the ceiling. The Grand Conclave Hall's architectural centerpiece was, or had been, a floating chandelier. 40 years of construction. By the account in his pre-mission briefing, solid Volhorian crystal and dense carved marble. Suspended at the apex of the dome by 3 anti-gravity repulsor nodes anchored to the ceiling structure. The whole assembly weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 tons, depending on which estimate you trusted. It was hanging directly above the gunship. The repulsor nodes were small, blue, glowing, no larger than a serving tray each. The kind of component that does its job invisibly because it does its job perfectly, and nobody thinks about what happens if it stops. Vane was thinking about it. "Your Highness," he said. Seraphine looked up from behind the dais wall where she'd taken cover. Her expression had changed. The composed certainty was gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest. "Stay exactly where you are," he said. "Don't move until I tell you." He looked at the MA9 on the ground where he'd dropped it, looked at his left arm. The pauldron was fused, the joint servo unresponsive. He couldn't raise the arm, couldn't use a standard firing position. He picked up the mass driver with his right hand, wedged the stock against his hip, and rested the barrel on the edge of the nearest piece of substantial wreckage, the curved rim of a fallen gallery platform. He looked up through the targeting overlay, calculated the angle, bypassed the SmartLink system because it would take 4 seconds to acquire, and he didn't have 4 seconds. He aimed at the central repulsor node, not the gunship, the node. He pulled the trigger. The coil drew everything the reactor had left, a surge that dimmed the HUD displays for a half second before the shot discharged. The slug went up, not at the gunship, but past it, a line of displaced air punching toward the ceiling. It hit the central repulsor node dead on. The node didn't just fail, it catastrophically failed. The disruption cascading through the anti-gravity field in the same moment the mass driver's impact severed its power coupling. The mathematics of the suspended chandelier, the careful, precise balance of forces that had kept it weightless for 4 decades collapsed in an instant. The remaining 2 nodes registered the sudden redistribution and immediately overloaded, both of them sparking out with a pair of sounds like someone breaking a very large light bulb. 60 tons of crystal and marble ceased to be a ceiling fixture. It became a rock in a gravity well. The pilot of the gunship had time to begin a evasive burn. The plasma cannon aborted its charge cycle. The repulsor lifts pitched upward at maximum thrust. None of it was enough, and none of it was close. Because 60 tons of stone falling from 30 meters doesn't care about your thrust rating. The chandelier hit the gunship's Class 8 vehicle shield. The shield was impressive. It genuinely was. It held for almost a full second a blinding, sustained pulse of dispersed energy. The barrier fighting the mass with everything it had. The gunship's generators pouring output into the field with total commitment. The sound it made in that second was immense. A resonant tearing frequency that shook the walls and knocked the remaining glass from its mountings. Then the generators burned out. All at once, the shield collapsed. 60 tons landed on the gunship. The impact shook the foundations of a building that had stood for 600 years. The floor cracked outward from the impact point in a starburst pattern that reached all the way to the outer walls. The blast wave from the compressed air threw shards of crystal and powdered marble across the entire courtyard in a horizontal cloud that stripped the scorched paint from Vane's remaining intact armor panels and knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground and lay there for a moment, listening to things fall. Then it was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows violence, full and heavy. The sound of everything that was moving having stopped. He got up. His left arm was completely offline. His HUD was showing 9 separate armor breach warnings. 3 of them in the amber range and 2 in the red. The biofoam seal on his hip was holding, but his mobility diagnostics were not encouraging. He let the empty mass driver fall. It hit the stone with a sound that echoed across the empty hall. He looked at what was left of the gunship. The chandelier had compressed it to roughly 40 centimeters of height. Hydraulic fluid and coolant made slow spreading shapes across the cracked marble. A single running light, somehow still powered, blinked once and went out. He turned. Seraphine was climbing out from behind the dais wall. Her dress, whatever it had been before, he hadn't paid that much attention, was ruined. Ash gray and darker where his blood had transferred to it when he'd held her down in the crater. Her hair, which had been a carefully maintained arrangement when the day started, was not that anymore. She stood at the edge of the debris field and looked at the flattened wreck. Then at him. Then back at the wreck. "You didn't break their shield," she said. Her voice was different from how it had been at the start of the day. Quieter, more careful. "You broke the sky above them." Vane reached up with his right hand and unsealed his helmet. The pressure locks released with a hiss, and he pulled it off, tucked it under his arm. He was a man in his late 30s, older than the body count he'd accumulated seemed to allow for, younger than his eyes suggested, gray in the hair, a face that had a jaw you'd notice and nothing else designed to call attention to itself. He spat blood onto the marble he'd bitten his cheek somewhere in the last 5 minutes and looked at her without particular affect. Gravity, he said. Universal constant. Never runs out of ammo. Kessler appeared from the shadows of the lower gallery, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has assessed that the immediate crisis is resolved and is now beginning to think about what comes next. His tie was gone. His hair was less than it had been. He stepped over a piece of chandelier without looking at it and stopped beside Vane. "Well done," he said quietly. Then he looked at Seraphine. She was still looking at the wreck, at the dead guards in their elegant armor, at the Terran Marine standing in the center of the destruction, bleeding onto her floor, one arm hanging useless, wearing the expression of someone who has finished a job and is already thinking about the next one, at everything that had been her world this morning, and was something else now. "Ambassador Wright," she said at last. Her voice had found its footing again, not the old composure that was gone, at least for today, but something steadier than shock. "About that mutual defense pact, Your Highness," Kessler said, with exactly the tone of a man who has been waiting for this moment since he landed. "Where do I sign?" Real violence doesn't look like the paintings. Seraphine had grown up surrounded by them, the great tapestries and murals that lined the ceremonial halls of the Valhorian palace, depicting the ancient conflicts of the Ascendancy's early centuries in careful, curated detail. Warriors in gleaming formations, fallen enemies arranged in postures of dignified repose, light-catching armor at the precise angle that made even devastation look considered. The artists had understood, instinctively or deliberately, that what their patrons wanted from depictions of war was the feeling of order, the reassurance that even at its most extreme, conflict had a shape to it, a grammar, a set of rules that kept it from being merely awful. The Grand Conclave Hall did not look like those paintings. It looked like what it was, a place where several people had died in a hurry, where the forces involved hadn't cared about aesthetics, and where everything that couldn't take a hit had taken one. The floating gallery platforms, 3 of them, maybe 4, had come down, either from the chandelier's impact wave or from the sustained beam fire that had cut through their repulsor mounts during the fighting. One had landed flat on the lower tier and cracked it through the middle. Another had folded against a wall and stayed there at an angle, shedding marble dust in a thin continuous stream. The decorative water features in the secondary gallery had been vaporized, not broken. Vaporized. The water and the ornamental stonework gone together in the heat of the plasma cannon's test discharge, leaving scorched rectangular absences where they'd been. The smell was the thing that hit her most. She had lived for over a century in spaces where the air was carefully maintained temperature, humidity, particulate content, fragrance. The Grand Enclave Hall had always carried that faint suggestion of rain and ozone, clean and neutral, the olfactory equivalent of a blank page. What it smelled like now was something she didn't have a direct reference for, but her body recognized anyway, at some level below conscious thought. Copper, char, the sulfurous residue of chemical propellants, something organic that she didn't want to think about too specifically. It smelled like the thing that happened when living systems stopped working. She stood at the edge of the dais and watched the Terran Marine Vane standing in the center of the wreckage, helmet tucked under his useless left arm, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of a man doing a quiet internal audit of his own systems. He was bleeding from at least 2 places she could identify at this distance. The joint below his ribs had a dark stain spreading outward through the gaps in his armor. There was something wrong with the left side of his face, a graze. Maybe, she couldn't tell. He looked like a machine that had been run past its rated capacity and was now sitting idle, waiting to find out if it would restart. Then the sky outside the dome darkened, not clouds. The sound was wrong for clouds, a deep structural vibration that she felt in her feet before she heard it with her ears, the kind of resonance that large engines make when they're doing serious work close to the ground. She looked up through the ragged hole in the dome. 3 shapes descended through it. Not the smooth silver teardrops of Valhorian response vessels, which were already approaching from the city's perimeter, and which she could see banking into holding patterns at a respectful distance from whatever was happening here. These were different, blocky, angular, dark gray in a way that wasn't a color choice so much as the natural result of building something from dense metals without spending any time thinking about what it looked like. They bristled with external hardware weapon mounts, sensor pods, additional armor plating, bolted over the original plating in places where someone had decided the original wasn't enough. They fell rather than descended. The thruster systems kept them from being in freefall. but only barely. They came down fast and loud and hot, the exhaust from their attitude jets scorching the remaining intact marble in rough circles below each craft. They touched down in a triangle formation around the chandelier's impact point, and they did it simultaneously, with a synchronized crash of landing struts that shook the floor. The ramps dropped. 40 Marines came out. They were nothing like the Velhorian Royal Guard. She watched them move and understood immediately, in a way that bypassed analysis and went straight to instinct, that these were not soldiers in any ceremonial sense of the word. They wore bulky matte green combat plating that added mass to already substantial frames, not the elegant form-fitting hardlight armor of her own guards, but something that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought the main function of armor was to absorb as much punishment as possible before the person inside ran out. They carried weapons that were, by any Velhorian standard, obscene: mass drivers, rotary cannons, large-bore shotguns, and, across 3 of them, devices she didn't recognize that her threat assessment would later identify as crew-served kinetic artillery, portable and shoulder-mounted. They established a perimeter in under 90 seconds, not by standing at the edges of the space, by moving through it, systematically, in pairs that swept each section and cleared it before moving to the next, physically placing themselves between the potential threat vectors and the people they'd been sent to protect. The surviving court members who hadn't made it out were treated not as the high-born nobility of a sovereign civilization, but as unknowns in a contested environment, which meant being moved firmly but without particular gentleness into clustered groups behind the structural columns, with Marines on all sides facing outward. One Velhorian duke, she thought it was Edrin, one of the senior court members, a man who had been insulted by receiving a response time of more than 10 minutes from a communication he'd sent, tried to object to being handled this way. The Marine who had been handling him listened to approximately 4 words of the objection and then moved the Duke to where he needed to be using a grip on the upper arm that was technically careful and practically immovable. Seraphine would have said something about it. She found she didn't. The medical team reached Vane while the perimeter was still being established. 2 corpsmen, moving fast, already opening cases before they'd fully stopped moving. They didn't greet him. They didn't ask how he was. One of them immediately began running a scanner over the damaged armor sections, while the other started working on the left pauldron with what she eventually understood was a power-cutting tool, a handheld angle grinder, its disc spinning at a speed she could barely follow, throwing a continuous arc of orange sparks as it bit into the fuse joint. The noise was enormous, high-pitched and sustained, metal screaming against metal. The sparks reflected off Vane's face in stuttering orange light. He had a leather strap between his teeth. His jaw muscles were visible at this distance. He was not making a sound. "Pressure's falling," one corpsman said, discarding the grinder and beginning to peel the damaged armor away in sections, each piece hitting the marble with a clatter. "Biofoam is holding the primary laceration, but there's shrapnel in the left leg. Multiple fragments. They've been moving. Get a line in," the other corpsman said, not looking up from the scanner. "Pump him full of coagulant." Now, the first corpsman produced a needle that made Seraphine's chest tighten on reflex, not small. Not the fine precision instruments her own medical staff used, but a thick steel bore designed to move fluid fast. No concessions to elegance. He found a vein in Vane's neck and placed the needle without ceremony. The way you'd drive a stake into ground you needed to mark. A bag of dark red fluid went up on a portable stand. Human blood, she realized. Stored and ready. Brought along the same way you'd bring ammunition, and the line ran from bag to needle without delay. She watched it. She couldn't stop watching it. The fluid ran down the clear tubing and disappeared into the Marine's body, and the monitor displays clipped to the portable stand ticked slowly, registering whatever they were designed to register. And the whole process had the quality of something entirely routine, something that had been done so many times that the people doing it had stopped noticing the strangeness of it. They were refilling him, like a machine with a reservoir. Kessler appeared at her left elbow. He was holding 2 cups synthetic material, utilitarian, the kind issued rather than chosen. He offered her one without asking whether she wanted it. The liquid inside was dark brown and steaming and smelled of something sharp and slightly chemical. "What is this?" she asked. Terranfield coffee. He took a sip from his own. His face didn't change, which she suspected was effort. "Tastes like something went wrong in a laboratory. Keeps the shock from settling in. Drink it." She took the cup. The first mouthful was scalding and bitter and tasted nothing like anything she normally consumed. And it was precisely Specifically real in a way that the last 90 minutes had been real, unmediated, physical, undeniable. She took a second sip. "Your people," she said, looking at the medical team working on Vane, across the courtyard. The corpsman had removed the entire upper section of his suit now, the chest plate and the damaged left arm assembly lying in pieces around him, without the armor. He was still a large man. The physiology modifications were visible in the structure of him. The density that wasn't natural, but he also looked, more clearly than he had in the suit, like a person who had been through something. The torso beneath the armor was covered in scars. Not the clean absence of marks that Velhorian dermal regeneration left behind, but raised white lines. Some of them significant histories written in healed damage across his chest and shoulders and upper arms. The record of a life conducted in close proximity to things that hurt you. They treat him like broken equipment, because that's what he is, Kessler said. His voice wasn't cold when he said it, just direct. A soldier is a tool. Your Highness. That's not an insult, it's a description. When the tool takes damage, you repair the damage and you put it back to work, because that's what the tool was built for. He kept himself between me and the cannon discharge, she said. He took a piece of marble through his side and didn't move. He was executing his orders. His orders were to demonstrate a weapons system. His orders were to protect the diplomatic assets at this summit and to demonstrate Terran military capabilities. Kessler took another sip of the terrible coffee. He did both. He would do it again tomorrow. Not because he has any particular feeling about you personally, but because he made a commitment to the man standing beside him in training. And that man made a commitment to the mission. And the mission runs back to Earth. He paused. That's the chain. It's not romantic, but it holds. She looked at Vane. The corpsmen had finished the initial trauma work and were now cleaning what they'd accessed, preparing it for the more careful work that would follow in a proper medical bay, beneath the suit's body glove. The damage was clearer, the shrapnel wounds in the left leg, the large contusion across the back where the thermal wave had cooked the armor plating and transferred heat through even the ceramic dissipation layers. A synthetic skin graft was being applied to the shoulder. The corpsman pressing it down with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone applying a patch to something functional. "I called your weapons a joke," Seraphine said. "I said you were primitive, in front of my entire court. You weren't the first." She looked at him. "You aren't the first, and you won't be the last," Kessler said, not unkindly. "It's the standard response. Every species we've dealt with sees the kinetic weapons, sees the chemical propellants, sees the physical armor, and draws the same conclusion. That we haven't figured out the better way yet. That we're working with rocks because we don't know about energy." He looked up at the hole in the dome, at the Velhorian response vessels holding their careful distance outside. "We know about energy. We choose mass, because mass doesn't have a support requirement. When the power grid goes down, when the solar event shorts out your quantum coupling, when the enemy figures out how to jam your field generator, a piece of dense metal moving very fast still does exactly what it was always going to do. You're saying we became dependent on our technology. I'm saying your technology became your entire military doctrine," he said. "There's a difference. Your shields are excellent. They're genuinely, impressively excellent, but you designed everything around them. Which means when someone finds the edge case, and there's always an edge case, you don't have a fallback." He looked at the flattened gunship beneath the chandelier's remains. "We're the fallback." She didn't answer immediately. She was watching the lead corpsman, the older of the two, the one who'd placed the IV, lean in close to the wound in Vane's side and say something. Vane shook his head. The corpsman said something else. Vane shook his head again and reached down with his good hand and wrapped his fingers around the fragment himself. She looked away. When she looked back, the fragment was on the ground and the corpsman was working. "Does he feel it?" she asked. "Yes," Kessler said. He chooses not to let it change what he's doing," Kessler said. "That's not the same as not feeling it." She sat down on a piece of broken marble, just sat down. Her court dress pooled around her in the ash. Without the careful, deliberate movement that she normally brought to every public action, she was tired. She recognized the feeling in a distant, academic way. Because she didn't normally experience it, her life was structured to prevent it, but it was unmistakable now. 3,000 years, she said. "We haven't fought a ground war in 3,000 years. Not a real one. Surgical strikes. Orbital interdiction, containment operations, but not this, not ground." "I know, our guards were trained," she said. "They were trained for this. They were trained for your version of this," Kessler said, "which is a different thing." The perimeter was fully established now. Marines at every entry point. 2 on each of the remaining intact gallery tiers, a pair by the diplomatic enclosure. One beside Vane, who wasn't helping with the medical work, but was simply standing with his back to the patient and his weapon across his body, watching the room. The surviving court members had stopped trying to move. Several of them were sitting. One was being talked through something by a Marine who appeared, improbably, to be doing it in passable Vilhorian, a young corporal, barely 20, speaking quietly and keeping her hands visible in a gesture that needed no translation. The Terran fleet's decision came through on the comm beacon 40 minutes after the gunship went down. A single encrypted transmission to Kessler's device, brief enough that she saw him read it, process it, and put it away without changing expression. He caught her looking. The verbal agreement you gave in the courtyard when you told Sergeant Vane to secure the area constitutes a provisional treaty authorization under Terran diplomatic law, he said. My superiors took it as confirmation to proceed. Proceed with what? He looked up, through the dome, past the Velhorian response vessels still holding their courteous perimeter distance. The sky was beginning to change. She couldn't see it yet, not directly. But the light was different, the late afternoon clarity interrupted by something. Some large mass in high orbit altering the way the sunlight reached the surface. The Separatist rebellion has been an ongoing problem for the Ascendancy for 11 years, Kessler said. Our intelligence assessment puts their primary ground assets at 7 armored columns in the Eastern Hemisphere and 3 fixed-position artillery installations in the northern continent. They've been waiting for an opportunity. He looked at her steadily. This summit was the opportunity, an attack on the Conclave Hall, the princess dead or captured, the political center in crisis. It would have worked, absent a complication. The complication being Sergeant Vane, the complication being Terran military presence. Yes, he adjusted his cuffs, an old habit. She suspected. Something he did when transitioning between modes of operation. The fleet is already moving. They'll begin the orbital interdiction within the hour and the ground operation shortly after. The Separatist columns are not aware of this yet. She thought about what that meant. 11 years of insurgency, of border raids and political assassinations, and the grinding asymmetric pressure of a conflict her ascendancy had been unable to fully resolve. 11 years of her government's careful, measured, surgical responses that hadn't worked, because the Separatists had been calibrated precisely to survive careful and measured. How long? She asked. For the ground assets. He thought about it. 48 hours. 72 at the outside. She stared at him. The entire campaign. Suppression of organized armed resistance. Yes, he didn't say it with pride. Exactly. More like the way you'd state a material property, not bragging about what iron does. Just noting it. We don't fight fair, Your Highness. That's a feature, not a limitation. She went to the wreckage of the courtyard one more time before they transferred Vane to the orbiting fleet medical facility. The corpsman had him on a transport frame, not a gurney. Nothing that gentle. Just a rigid composite litter with retaining straps that were efficient about the question of keeping him on it. He was conscious. His color was bad, and the left arm was immobilized in a carbon fiber sleeve, and he was looking at the ceiling with the particular vacancy of someone who is concentrating hard on not reacting to something. She stopped beside the frame. He moved his eyes to her without moving his head. They tell me you'll need stitches, she said, and time. Stitches and time, he repeated. His voice was rougher than it had been. Smoke inhalation. One of the corpsmen had mentioned. That's the standard order of operations. Our dermal regenerators, could they tried, he said. On the last posting. Doesn't take. My scar tissue is too established. The regenerators try to remodel it, and the inflammation response shuts them down. He said it without complaint. Just information. Old-fashioned way works fine. She looked at the bandaging on his side, at the splinted arm, at the systematic documentation of damage that the medical readouts clipped to his frame were quietly producing. It seems a great deal of pain for a works fine. Pain is information, he said. Tells you you're still in the process of being alive. She didn't have an answer for that. She stood there for a moment, not quite sure what she'd come to say or whether she'd said it. The courtyard around them was being documented by Terran logistics personnel, a team of 4 with scanning equipment, methodically recording the damage, the positions of the dead, the structural status of the remaining architecture. They worked the way all the Terrans worked, without visible emotion, without commentary. Just task execution at a pace that suggested. The task was what mattered, and the discussion of the task was a secondary consideration. We'll begin formal treaty discussions when you're recovered, she said finally. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the ceiling. I just do the job. Ma'am, he said, the treaty's above my pay grade. The transport lifted 20 minutes later, carrying him and 4 other Marines who had sustained significant damage in the perimeter establishment. She watched it go up through the hole in her dome, ascending smoothly toward the fleet in orbit. Kessler stood beside her, finishing the last of his terrible coffee. 46 hours and 11 minutes later, by her count, the last organized separatist ground unit surrendered to Terran Expeditionary Force Command in the Eastern Highlands. The artillery installations had been taken out in the first 6 hours, removed from the equation by tungsten kinetic impactors dropped from low orbit with an accuracy that her own people's targeting systems couldn't match solid metal. No electronics more sophisticated than basic guidance. Impossible to jam. Arriving at a velocity that made the shield question irrelevant, the Separatists had prepared for 11 years against a Volhorian response. They'd had 46 hours against a Terran one, her generals, who had spent the better part of a decade developing careful measured responses to the insurgency. Sent her a joint communique that used the word alarming 4 times and unprecedented twice. She read it, set it aside, and looked out the window of her temporary quarters. In the administrative complex, the palace was being assessed for structural integrity after the chandelier's impact wave had traveled through the city's foundations at the sky above Vel Auris. 3 heavy cruisers in low atmospheric orbit, dark gray, angular, ugly in the way that purely functional things sometimes are. They blotted out a section of the afternoon sky and cast a long shadow over the capital that moved slowly as they tracked their orbital path. She had lived under that sky for over a century without ever once worrying about what was in it. She thought about what Kessler had said, about fallbacks, about the edge cases that always existed somewhere in every perfect system, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. She thought about a man pulling a piece of her own courtyard out of his side without making a sound, and about a pocket watch playing a simple tune in a medical bay that smelled of recycled air and industrial solvent. She picked up a secure comm and called her diplomatic secretary. I need the treaty framework documents on my desk by morning, she said, all of them, and get me a direct line to Ambassador Kessler. She put the comm down. Outside, the cruisers moved across the sky, slow and heavy and entirely, specifically real, for the first time in a very long time. She didn't look away from them. The TCS Gettysburg was not designed with visitors in mind. This was apparent from the moment Seraphine stepped off the shuttle at the docking collar and into the ship's secondary receiving bay, a space that communicated, without any ambiguity, that its purpose was functional and its aesthetic considerations had ended there. The walls were dark gray steel, exposed conduit running in organized bundles along the ceiling, lighting panels recessed behind protective grills that gave the illumination a slightly industrial quality, as though the light itself had been issued rather than installed. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and the faint chemical undertone of whatever compound the maintenance teams used on the deck, plating something practical and slightly astringent that her sinuses noted and declined to make peace with. Everything was bolted down or racked or secured in some other manner that spoke to the expectation of violent motion. The handholds along the corridor walls were worn smooth in the places where hands naturally fell, which meant they'd been used, consistently, by many people over a long period. The corridor widths were wider than they needed to be for foot traffic. She realized wide enough for 2 armored Marines moving in opposite directions, or for a medical transport frame with personnel on both sides. She'd brought 2 members of her remaining guard staff. They wore their ceremonial armor, which looked, in this context, roughly the way an evening gown looks at a construction site. The 2 Terran Marines who had met the shuttle at the docking collar glanced at the Volhorian armor once, registered it, filed it somewhere in the back of their operational awareness, and thereafter paid attention to everything else in the space instead. They led the way without commentary. The ship was large. She'd understood this intellectually. The Gettysburg was a heavy cruiser, one of 3 currently in low atmospheric orbit, but walking through it was different from understanding it. The corridors branched and rejoined in patterns that she couldn't fully map. And through bulkhead doors left open for transit, she caught glimpses of spaces that suggested the full scope of what the Terrans brought to an engagement. An armory corridor where weapons were racked floor to ceiling in precise arrangements, and a pair of technicians were doing maintenance on something that required a torque tool and considerable upper body strength. A briefing room where 12 Marines sat in rows watching a topographic display of what she recognized as the Eastern Volhorian Highlands. A bay where 2 of the combat drop ships were suspended on maintenance cradles. their undersides open, and 3 different teams working on different systems simultaneously, the noise level approximating a moderate industrial operation. No one stopped working when she passed. A few people looked up. Most didn't. She found she respected that. The medical bay was on the ship's 3rd level. Centrally located, she noted the logic of this. The way the placement reduced the distance from any part of the ship to the place you'd need to reach in an emergency. The same logic that had determined the corridor widths and the handholds and every other feature of the design. Function first, and function thoroughly considered. 2 Marines stood outside the blast door. They didn't salute her. They stepped to the side and let the door open, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The medical bay was loud in a specific way, not chaotic, but full of the continuous small sounds of systems doing their jobs. Monitors cycling, ventilation, the pressurized hiss of automated medication dispensers running their schedules. 8 treatment stations, 4 of them occupied. The occupants in various states of post-operational repair. She didn't look at them closely. It felt intrusive in a way she couldn't fully articulate. A violation of something that didn't have a name in Vilhorian protocol, but clearly had one in whatever private code governed these people. Vane was at the far end, which she'd expected. The station farthest from the door was also the one with the most monitoring equipment attached to it, which suggested the patient whose condition most warranted attention. He was sitting up in a metal cot that appeared to have been designed for structural durability rather than comfort, wearing gray sweatpants and a faded black shirt that read "Eat Dirt" across the chest in block letters that had been washed enough times to lose their crispness. His left arm was in a rigid carbon fiber splint, bound to his side from elbow to shoulder. The left side of his face held a bruise that had developed into the deep purple yellow of something working its way through its process. A thick panel of synthetic skin graft covered most of his left shoulder. He was eating from a metal bowl, something gray and textured that she identified, eventually, as reconstituted protein supplement, a standard field ration, eaten from standard field issue cutlery, in the medical bay of a warship. Because apparently there was no version of Vane's life that defaulted to comfort when functional would do. He looked up when she stopped at the foot of his cot, his eyes gray, she noticed now, in the way that some stones are gray. Not colorless, but specifically that color registered her presence with the same economy he brought to everything else. "Princess," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been, textured by smoke damage and time. He didn't attempt to stand or alter his posture. "Sergeant Vane." She paused. There was a small metal stool beside the cot, the kind of seat that had been included as a practical concession to the fact that medical care sometimes required another person to be stationary nearby for an extended period. She moved it with her foot and sat down. "The Separatist rebellion has been suppressed. Your fleet completed the operation 46 hours after the initial engagement." Heard. He put a spoonful of the gray substance into his mouth and chewed without visible enthusiasm. 46 hours is on the slower end for a pacification campaign of that scale. Terrain in the Eastern Highlands is difficult, limits the drop angles. Your generals consider it an exceptional result. "My generals," he said, with a slight inflection that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite dismissiveness, "have a gift for understatement." She clasped her hands in her lap, around them. The medical bay continued its quiet mechanical conversation with itself, and the other patients in their stations were far enough away and absorbed enough in their own recovery that the end of the room where they sat had a quality close to privacy. "Your doctors tell me your body rejected our dermal regenerators," she said, "when they tried to use them during your initial treatment. The field team tried the portable version." "Yeah." He looked at the graft on his shoulder without particular feeling. "The Vilhorian regeneration process works by signaling the surrounding tissue to remodel. My scar tissue has been through that signal enough times, from enough different directions, that the response pathway is essentially saturated. It reads the regenerator output as noise and ignores it." He shrugged the right shoulder. "Happens with some long service personnel. Too much accumulated repair. The old-fashioned method works fine. Stitches and time. Stitches and time," he confirmed. "You said that before. It keeps being true." She watched him eat for a moment. There was something almost meditative about it, the mechanical repetition of spoon to bowl to mouth, the absence of any performance around the activity. He was eating because his body required fuel and he was providing it. That was the entirety of the situation from his apparent perspective. "I came to apologize," she said. He stopped eating. He put the spoon down in the bowl with a small careful sound and looked at her, not with surprise. Exactly, more like the expression of someone who has filed a piece of incoming information and is taking a moment to place it correctly. For the reception, she said. For everything I said in the conclave hall before your arrival. For making it a public performance. She kept her voice level, because the alternative was allowing the shame which had been sitting in her chest since the moment she'd watched him pull marble shrapnel out of his own body without flinching to become something messy and self-indulgent. And that wouldn't serve either of them. I used your people's military as a punchline, in front of my entire court. I said your weapons were a joke. They kind of are, he said. She looked at him, compared to Velhorian tech, objectively. Chemical propellants are extremely low-efficiency energy delivery systems. He picked the spoon back up. That's true. It's also true that low efficiency and low effectiveness are different things, and that the gap between them is where Terran military doctrine lives. But I'm not going to tell you the assessment was wrong. It just wasn't the right assessment for the question you were actually trying to answer. Which question was that? Whether we were worth taking seriously. He ate another spoonful of the gray food. We are. Not because our weapons are impressive by your standards, they're not. Because the people using them have a particular relationship with losing that your military hasn't had occasion to develop. She thought about the guards. The ceremonial armor melting under beam fire. The way they'd stood in their elegant formations waiting for a kind of combat they'd been trained for, and died facing a different kind entirely. Tell me something, she said. She heard, as she said it, how different her voice was from the one she'd used in the conclave hall that morning, however many days ago it felt now. Less architecture to it, less distance. Why do you fight this way? Not the tactical rationale. I understand the tactical rationale. Kessler was very thorough. I mean, why you? Personally, why does a person choose this? Vane was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding how much to reveal, but the quiet of someone locating the honest answer rather than the convenient one. I didn't choose it. Exactly, he said. I mean, I signed the paperwork, so technically yes, I chose it. But it wasn't a decision I made after considering the alternatives. It was more like recognizing something about how I was built and finding the application for it. He looked at the bowl. Some people are built for the parts of civilization that happen after someone else has made them safe. I'm built for the part that comes before. That's a very specific way to understand yourself. Took a while to get there. He put the bowl down on the small table beside the cot. When you're young in this job, you think it's about something bigger, about ideals or duty or I don't know, protecting something abstract. And those things are real. They exist. They matter. But eventually you're far enough into it that what it comes down to is the person next to you, the specific person, with a specific name, who is going to have a bad day if you make a mistake. That gets smaller and smaller until it's almost nothing. And somehow the smaller it gets, the more it holds. She thought of the moment in the crater, the heat washing over the lip, his armored back between her and the plasma discharge. The temperature warnings she hadn't heard but that the readouts had later confirmed. She hadn't been a concept to him in that moment. She'd been a warm body in a hole in the ground that needed to still be warm when the firing stopped. There was something clarifying about that. My general staff sent me a communiqué, she said, after the campaign concluded. 4 uses of the word alarming. They are concerned about the strategic implications of having a Terran fleet in our home system. Reasonable concern. They also, she said, cannot explain how 11 years of insurgency was resolved in 46 hours. They're having difficulty integrating it into their existing models. Their models were built for energy weapon engagements with opposing forces that had equivalent shields, he said. The separatists were calibrated against you, your doctrine, your weapons, your response timelines. They'd spent over a decade learning how to survive your version of this. Nobody told them to prepare for orbital kinetics. Nobody could have. That's the idea. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the ship's middle distance, something large and mechanical was being moved. She could feel the vibration of it through the deck. A low, irregular rhythm that came and went. Normal ship activity. The ongoing work of a vessel that was always in some phase of maintenance or preparation. I keep thinking about what you said, she said, in the crater. About dirt. He raised an eyebrow. The bruising on the left side of his face gave the expression an asymmetry that was, she found, more human than the composed stillness of everything around her on this ship. You said you weren't born into mud because you chose it, she said. That Earth isn't a paradise. That you fought for every inch or you died. She paused. I've read the planetary surveys, of course, the academic literature. But I don't think I understood it as a lived condition until you said it that way. It's not. He stopped. Started again, differently. The thing people miss when they read the surveys is the timeline. Earth's gravity is on the heavy side of habitable. The weather systems are violent and non-uniform. About a third of the landmass is either too cold or too dry to sustain agriculture without significant intervention. We had those conditions, and we had roughly 8 billion people. And for most of our history, we didn't have enough of anything. Food, land, time, stability. We said just enough. Always just enough. With the constant awareness that just enough was a temporary condition, and the thing that would shift the balance was usually going to be a conflict. So the weapons evolved from necessity. The weapons evolved from the need to not die, he said, which sounds like the same thing but isn't quite. Necessity implies you had options and chose the efficient one. We mostly didn't have options. We had the thing that worked and the thing that didn't. And if you used the thing that didn't, you became a historical footnote that someone else wrote about after they took your land. He looked at the ceiling, 3,000 years ago. When your people were having their last ground war, whatever that was, we were in the middle of a period where we were fighting each other over access to river water. Not for any ideological reason. Because the alternative was dying of thirst. The room was quiet for a moment. We have philosophers, he said. Ancient ones, really ancient, going back 4,000 or 5,000 years. And they were brilliant. They thought about justice and ethics and the nature of reality in ways that are still worth reading. But they were writing at the same time that other people were starving 30 miles away. And the disconnect between the philosophy happening in one room and the desperation happening in the next one, that's Earth. That's always been Earth. Both things at once, right next to each other, never resolved. It sounds exhausting, she said. It is, he said simply. That's not a complaint. It's just what it is. She looked at his hands. The right one, the functional one, was resting on the blanket over his legs. It was, she thought, the most expressive physical record of a person she had ever seen. The knuckles were enlarged in the way that happens from repeated impact. The skin on the back of the hand holding small white scars in 3 or 4 places. The calluses at the base of the fingers thick enough to see from where she was sitting. A hand that had been through a considerable portion of what hands can go through and had adapted continuously to the requirements. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. What did you think was going to happen before the summit, when you scheduled the demonstration and decided to make it public?" She considered being diplomatic about it, decided against it. Given the direction, the conversation had already gone. "I thought you would send a hologram," she said, "or a recorded simulation. Something polished and controlled that we would watch and respond to with appropriate courtesy and then decline. I expected Ambassador Kessler to accept the decline gracefully and return to Earth to report that the Velhorian Ascendancy had considered the proposal and found the terms incompatible." She paused. "I planned to be very polite about it, and instead we dropped a Marine through your ceiling. And instead you dropped a Marine through my ceiling." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, acknowledging the situation without fully committing to the expression. "That's Kessler's design, the theatrical element. I just go where I'm pointed. You do considerably more than that," she said. He didn't argue. He also didn't agree. He reached past the bowl on the bedside table to something she hadn't noticed, a small object. Flat, circular, matte silver. He picked it up with the right hand, and she recognized it as a pocket watch, not a display device. Not a timepiece with any technological component she could identify, a mechanical watch. The kind that ran on a wound spring and a series of gears that converted stored tension into consistent motion. Old technology. Simple technology. The kind of thing that had been superseded and retained anyway, for reasons that weren't practical. He turned it over once. Then he clicked it open with his thumb. A sound came out. It was music, in the loosest sense of the word. A small steel mechanism. A few tines struck in sequence by a rotating drum, a music box movement fitted into a watch case, playing a melody that was simple enough that she could hold the entire shape of it in her mind after hearing it twice. 8 bars, maybe 10. The kind of tune that a person could hum. Nothing like the complex harmonic structures of Velhorian musical tradition, which required trained appreciation and years of contextual knowledge to fully access. Nothing that would win recognition in any serious concert hall. She listened to it play through once. "We make things," he said, watching the watch. "Art, music, buildings just for the sake of being beautiful. We love people. We raise children and teach them things we figured out the hard way. And some of those things are about fighting, and some of them are about everything else. It's not only survival. It never was only survival. The mechanism played on, the tiny melody cycling. But someone has to be at the door, he said. His voice was quieter now. Not softer, quieter. The distinction mattered. Someone has to stand in the part that's dark so the lit part stays lit. That's not a metaphor. It's a description of an actual job that actual people do. And those people are not going to be the same people who are sitting inside writing the music. That's not a complaint either. It's just a division of labor that someone has to be honest about. The tune wound down. The last note hung in the recycled air of the medical bay for a moment before the mechanism clicked to the end of its cycle and went still. He closed the watch. I don't fight the way I fight because I haven't imagined anything better, he said. I fight the way I fight so that the people who are busy imagining something better don't have to stop and deal with this. He set the watch back on the table. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. She sat with that. It was not a small thing to sit with. It wasn't the kind of statement that resolved cleanly or allowed the comfortable shift to the next item of business. It sat in the room between them and declined to be smaller than it was. She thought about the tapestries in the palace halls, the clean fallen enemies and the gleaming armor and the sense of order imposed on violence by people who'd had the luxury of distance. She thought about what the conclave hall looked like now, the gouges in the floor, the scorched stone, the absence of the chandelier that had hung there for 4 decades. She thought about the fact that she had insisted, explicitly, against the recommendation of every architect and court administrator who'd asked, that none of it be touched. I told my staff not to repair the hall, she said. Before I came here, I told them to leave it. He looked at her. The crater from your drop pod, the scorch marks, the damage to the floor. She kept her hand still in her lap. I want it to stay. Why? Because I think we need to be able to see it, she said. I think my people need to look at what actually happened and understand that the world doesn't smooth itself out just because you find it aesthetically objectionable. She paused. And because I owe it something, the honesty of leaving it there. After a century of the paintings, Vane looked at her for a long moment, not assessing. Exactly. Something more like recognition, the look of a person who has heard something they weren't certain they'd hear. He didn't say anything. He picked up the bowl and the spoon and went back to his food, because it was still there and still required eating. And that was the kind of person he was. But the set of his shoulders was, she thought, slightly different. She stood. The metal legs of the stool scraped against the deck plating, loud in the quiet. The treaty framework, she said. Kessler tells me the terms are clear enough that the formal signing could be completed within the week. I'll take his word for it. I would like, she said, carefully, for the signing to take place in the courtyard, in the crater. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's above my pay grade. I know. She moved the stool back to where it had been, precise about it. But I thought you should know. She turned to leave. She'd taken 2 steps when he spoke. Seraphine. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her name, not her title, not her rank, her name. The way a person says the name of another person they've decided to speak to directly. Thank you, he said, for coming down here. She turned just far enough to see him, the bowl in his right hand, looking at the opposite wall. You're welcome, Sergeant Vane. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard the small sound of a spoon on the inside of a metal bowl, steady and unhurried, doing the next thing that needed doing. The architects came to her 3 times. The first time, the morning after her visit to the Gettysburg, with a damage assessment prepared by the senior Restotrain team and a preliminary timeline for repairs. They were respectful about it. They were always respectful, but the numbers they brought were designed to be persuasive. The chandelier alone had transferred enough kinetic energy to the floor below it to compromise the load-bearing integrity of 2 sublevels. The blast door from the drop pod had left a fracture in the pillar it had struck that would propagate if left unaddressed. The plasma discharge that had vaporized the royal dais would require complete reconstruction of the subfloor anchoring system. These were not cosmetic concerns. They told her. These were structural ones. She told them to repair the structure and leave everything else. The second time, they came with renders, digital projections of what the hall could look like, would look like. Given enough time and the right materials returned to something approaching its original state. They had sourced replacement crystal for the chandelier from the same quarry on Velmiron that the original had come from. The pale iridescent stone of the floor could be matched to within a few % of the original color. Given 18 months, they said, you would not know anything had happened here. She looked at the renders for a long time. The pristine surfaces, the floating platforms restored to their proper altitudes, the chandelier hanging at the apex of the repaired dome, catching light the way it had for 4 decades. As though the afternoon the Callan separatists had come through the ceiling was simply a gap in the record, a page removed. She handed the renders back and told them no. The third time, the head of the restoration team came alone, without the renders or the assessment documents, and simply asked her, directly, and with the careful respect of someone who had worked for her for a long time, why. She thought about how Vane had described Earth, both things at once, right next to each other, never resolved. The philosophy in one room and the desperation in the next, and the honesty of refusing to pretend the wall between them was thicker than it was. Because we were wrong about something, she said, and the room is the proof. If we fix the room, we lose the proof, and eventually we'll be wrong about the same thing again. She looked at the damage assessment in his hands. Repair the structure, brace the pillar, address whatever creates a safety concern. Everything else stays. He nodded and left, and didn't come back a 4th time. The formal signing was scheduled for 10 days after the battle. Kessler had wanted 2 weeks, the standard buffer for treaty documentation of this complexity, he said. Time to ensure that everything in the agreement language meant exactly what both parties intended it to mean. No ambiguities left in place to be exploited later by someone with a creative legal interpretation. Seraphine had pushed back to 10 days, and he'd accepted it in the way that she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, a brief assessment. A calculation of whether this was a hill worth contesting, and then a clean yes. She had spent the intervening time reading, not the treaty documents. Those were being handled by her legal staff and Kessler's, a parallel process that generated significant paperwork and periodic summary reports she reviewed each evening. She read Terran military history. She had access to the materials through the diplomatic exchange channels that had been formally opened the morning after the battle, and she used them. Beginning at the beginning, the earliest documented large-scale conflicts on Earth, and working forward through what turned out to be an extraordinarily dense and continuous record of organized violence stretching across several thousand years of uninterrupted practice. She had approached it academically. By the 3rd day, she had stopped being able to read it that way. It was not that the history was uniformly grim, though significant portions of it were, but that it had a quality she hadn't expected, a texture. The Volhorian historical record of the Ascendancy's early conflicts read like what it was, accounts composed after the fact, with the retrospective knowledge of how things had turned out, shaped by the understanding of their meaning. The Terran record was different. It was full of people who didn't know what came next. Soldiers writing letters home from positions they didn't know they wouldn't survive. Field commanders making decisions with incomplete information under conditions of active confusion. The unedited quality of a species in the middle of something, recording it in real time without the comfort of knowing how it resolved. She found this not inspiring. Exactly, not comforting. Something more accurate than either. She found it true, which was its own category. The morning of the signing, she stood in the Grand Conclave Hall and looked at what it had become. The structural repairs were complete. The 2 compromised sublevels had been reinforced. The fractured pillar had been stabilized with a carbon fiber internal brace that added a slight geometric irregularity to its profile if you looked for it, and she had decided to leave that visible rather than cosmetically covering it. The blast door that Vane had kicked out of the pod on arrival had been found. It had gone 20 meters into the pillar and required extraction tools to recover, and was now resting against the wall of the lower gallery, still embedded in its chunk of removed marble, placed there deliberately. The rest was as it had been the moment the firing stopped. The crater from the drop pod, roughly 4 meters across, the edges of it showing the compressed, fractured quality that came from a large amount of force applied in a very short time. The parallel gouge marks where the Taurian drone had been pushed 3 feet across the courtyard. By kinetic transfer, the drone itself had been removed, but the marks remained. The scorch lines from the separatist beam weapons, cut across the floor at angles that recorded exactly where the firing had come from and where it had been aimed. The vaporized rectangle where the Royal Dace had been, the subfloor beneath it still showing the glassy residue that extreme localized heat leaves on stone, and the impact zone where the chandelier had landed. A rough circle of compressed and fractured stone roughly 15 meters across, the center of it depressed by about half a meter from the sheer weight of what had come down. The chandelier's remains had been cleared. There had been no alternative. The debris was structural, but the depression remained. And within it, preserved under a transparent environmental seal that the restoration team had installed as the one concession to practicality. The flattened outline of what had been a Callan separatist gunship, pressed into the stone like a fossil. She stood in the center of it and thought about the renders, the pristine surfaces, the chandelier restored as though it had never fallen. She thought. No, she thought. This is what it cost. And then she went to get ready for the signing. The Terran contingent arrived first. 3 shuttles. Coming down through the repaired dome, she had allowed a section of the ceiling to be left open. The ragged hole edged in temporary sealant that kept the weather out but preserved the shape of the original breach. Kessler came down the ramp of the lead shuttle in a fresh charcoal suit, which she was beginning to understand was less a clothing choice than a kind of uniform. He carried a heavy leather folder under his arm and moved across the scarred courtyard with the unhurried authority of a man entirely comfortable operating in spaces that were not designed for comfort. Behind him, from the second shuttle, came the Marine escort, 8 soldiers in full combat plate, matte green, weapons slung but present, establishing a loose perimeter around the signing area with the casual efficiency of people for whom perimeter establishment is something done automatically, like breathing. From the third shuttle came Vane. He was in dress uniform, dark green, sharply creased, the kind of thing that involved visible effort to produce and wore the evidence of that effort in its precise lines and deliberate details. The left arm was still in the splint, which the uniform had been cut to accommodate, and he was using a composite cane on the left side. His weight shifted slightly to compensate for what she understood was shrapnel damage in the left leg that was healing on the standard timeline for someone who had declined Vilhorian regenerative assistance. He moved with the particular gait of someone who is managing pain by not giving it their full attention, not hiding it, just not featuring it. Across his chest, the dress uniform carried what she'd been told were service decorations. Medals, in the Terran designation, small metal pendants on colored ribbons, each one corresponding to a specific engagement or qualification. She had asked Kessler about them in one of the working sessions over the preceding days. He'd given her a brief accounting. None of them were ceremonial. None of them were issued for attendance or rank or the passage of time. They were, collectively, a condensed record of places Vane had been and things he'd done. And the fact that they all existed meant he had come back from each of those places, which was itself a form of information. She watched him come down the ramp. He moved slowly, but he moved. His eyes went across the courtyard in the practiced sweep that she'd seen in every Terran Marine she'd interacted with an automatic assessment, registering positions and distances and the locations of the other people in the space, done in about 2 seconds without visible thought. His eyes found the crater from the drop pod and stayed there for a moment. She thought she understood why. She'd thought about it. Over the 10 days, what it would mean to come back to a place where you'd nearly died and find it preserved exactly as you'd left it. The impression of your arrival still in the stone. The record of the subsequent hours held in the damage patterns on the walls and floor. She had worried, briefly, that it might be a difficult thing to return to. She had decided, after consideration, that Vane was not the kind of person for whom difficult was the same as wrong. She walked out to meet him. He stopped when he saw her coming. He stood straight, the cane taking his weight. The injured arm held still, and there was a quality to the straightening that she recognized as a choice rather than a reflex. He could have leaned on the cane more. He chose not to. "Sergeant Vane," she said. "Your Highness." He looked at her, then at the courtyard around them. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the scorch marks, the gouge lines, the crater, the preserved shape of the gunship in the impact zone, the blast door embedded in the marble pillar against the gallery wall. "You left it." "Yes." He looked at the crater. "My drop pod made that." "It did." "The floor crew is going to have opinions about that when I file my after action." "I'll write them a letter," she said. That corner of the mouth thing happened again. Still not quite a smile. Something adjacent. Approached from a careful distance. He looked at the crater for another moment, then shifted his attention back to her with the economy of someone who has processed what needed processing and is ready to move to the next item. "Kessler said you wanted the signing out here." "I did. The treaty says the Terran military will provide physical security for the Velhorian ascendancy," he said. "Defend your borders. Garrison your positions. Introduce kinetic physics to anyone who presents a threat you can't handle, in exchange for slipspace coordinates and medical technology." He looked at the heavy leather folder in Kessler's hands. 30 feet away. That's essentially it, in considerably more words. Yes, always more words. He shifted his weight on the cane. "You understand what you're agreeing to." Having us here. It's not a subtle arrangement. We don't do subtle. I noticed. The cruisers in orbit. He looked up. Not at the sky specifically, but in the direction of it. The way you look toward a sound. 3 of them right now. If the treaty holds, it won't be 3. It'll be more. Terran military installations on Valhorian soil. Marines in your cities during leave. The cultural contact alone, Sergeant Vane. She said it steadily. Not sharply. Just clearly enough to stop the sentence. I have read 11 days of Terran military history. I have had 14 working sessions with Ambassador Kessler on the treaty terms. I have convened 4 sessions with my general staff and 2 with my civilian cabinet. She paused. I understand what I'm agreeing to. He looked at her. I know what it costs, she said. I also know what the alternative costs. We've been paying it for 11 years and the bill hasn't gotten smaller. She held his gaze. I would rather have the thing that works than the thing that is comfortable. He was quiet for a moment. Your Highness, Kessler called across the courtyard. He was standing at the improvised signing table, a flat piece of composite material set across 2 equipment cases from the shuttle. Exactly as dignified as the situation required, and not a degree more, with his folder open and the expression of someone who is ready to do the work. Whenever you're prepared. The table was set at the edge of the crater. Seraphine had specified this in the arrangements, over the objections of her protocol staff, who had at least 3 separate concerns about the symbolism and 1 practical concern about the uneven surface. She'd addressed the practical concern by having the area leveled slightly, which was the only concession she made. The symbolic concerns she had listened to and noted and set aside. She stood on one side of the table. Kessler stood on the other. Vane stood slightly behind and to Kessler's right, which was not a protocol position but a tactical one, the angle that put him between the ambassador and the highest probability approach vectors from the gallery tiers. She'd noticed him take it without discussion and without being directed. Her own guard was present in the gallery. She'd requested, through Kessler, that they wear the new equipment that had been arriving from Terran Supply over the past several days, ablative chest rigs over their standard tunics, and across their backs. The Tan-manufactured pulse rifles that the Terran military had been authorized to provide as part of the preliminary security arrangements that had gone into effect verbally in the hours after the battle. They were not comfortable in the new equipment. She could see it in the way they held themselves, the slightly uncertain weight distribution, the unfamiliar angles of the slung weapons. They would learn. She had been specific about that with her guard commander. They would train in the equipment until it was natural, not until it was adequate. There was a difference. The document itself was 12 pages of treaty language. Kessler walked her through the key provisions in a summary that took approximately 8 minutes, concise and precise in equal measure. She had read the full text twice and her legal staff had read it a dozen more times, and there were no surprises in Kessler's summary. But she listened carefully anyway because she had learned, in the past 10 days, that Kessler's choice of what to emphasize in a summary was itself a form of information. When he finished, he set the folder flat on the composite table and turned it toward her. The pen was brass, heavy, the kind of instrument that treats the act of signing as something with weight to it. She picked it up, looked at the document, at the Terran seal at the top, an eagle, wings extended, which she'd learned was an image from Earth's natural history, a predatory bird that had once been nearly eradicated and had recovered, which struck her as an appropriate thing to put on a military document, at the dense, careful language beneath it. 12 pages of commitment rendered in words precise enough that they would mean the same thing in 100 years as they meant today. She signed her name at the bottom of the final page. She didn't hesitate. She had made the decision before she came down to the courtyard, and she saw no point in performing uncertainty she didn't feel. She straightened. Kessler countersigned. He closed the folder and held it under his arm and gave her a small nod, not a bow. She had noticed that the Terrans tended to use nods where other cultures used deeper forms of acknowledgement, as though they'd decided that inclining the whole upper body was more than the situation usually required. Then the sky changed. She had been told it was coming. Kessler had mentioned it in the morning briefing, a low atmospheric repositioning of the fleet elements currently in high orbit, dropping to a lower altitude as a visible demonstration of the treaty's immediate practical effect. She had understood this intellectually, had nodded at the appropriate point in the briefing and moved on to the next item. Understanding it intellectually had not prepared her for what it looked like. The 3 heavy cruisers came down through the cloud layer together, holding formation with a precision that was itself a kind of statement. They were lower than they'd been in the days since the battle. low enough that she could see the individual weapon systems on their hulls, the mass driver turrets. Each one large enough to put a vehicle-sized projectile into the surface from this altitude, with targeting accuracy measured in meters. The kinetic missile pods along their flanks, closed now, flush against the hull, but present in the same way that a fact is present even when it isn't being stated. They were the ugliest things she had ever seen in her sky. Ugly in the specific way of things that are built entirely around function, where every surface exists because it does something, rather than because it looks right. No curves that weren't load-bearing. No material that wasn't structural. The color was the gray of exposed metal, and the texture was the texture of a thing that expected to be hit and had been designed accordingly, against the afternoon sky of Vel Oris, which was a particular shade of blue that she had looked at her entire life. They were an intrusion of a different register entirely. Around her, the gallery had gone very quiet, her court reduced from what it had been. The outer tiers still showing the absence of the people who had been relocated after the battle, pending security clearance, looked up at the three ships. She watched their faces. The bioluminescent undertone of their garments shifted through several colors in quick succession, none of them settling. The emotional ambivalence of the moment too complex to resolve into a single readable shade. She looked up at the ships herself, 3,000 years. She had been alive for more than a century of that. And for every year of it, the sky above Vel Oris had been what she expected it to be: beautiful, static, the same blue-to-dark progression that the climate systems maintained and the architecture had been designed to showcase. She had looked at it her whole life without needing to think about what was in it, because nothing in it had ever required her attention. The ships were in it now, dark and heavy and permanent and absolutely, specifically real. She found, standing in the ruined courtyard with a signed treaty in Kessler's folder, and the sound of her remaining guard adjusting to the weight of unfamiliar weapons in the gallery above, that she was not afraid of them. She was not comfortable, either. She suspected she wasn't supposed to be comfortable. Comfort, she was beginning to understand, was a thing you built inside a perimeter, not the perimeter itself. You couldn't mistake the walls for the room and then act surprised when the room got cold. A pleasure doing business, Your Highness, Kessler said. He was already moving back toward the shuttle, the folder under his arm, the slightly elevated pace of a man with the next item on the agenda already in mind. She watched him go with something between amusement and respect, which was, she suspected, how most people ended up feeling about Kessler. She turned. Vane was still standing at the edge of the crater. He was looking at the depression in the floor, the compressed record of the chandelier's arrival, the preserved shape of the flattened gunship under its environmental seal. He had the expression he sometimes had when he was doing the quiet internal accounting that she was coming to understand was less a mood than a continuous process, the way certain systems run in the background regardless of what else is happening. She walked over. He heard her coming. She noticed that he always heard people coming, regardless of whether he appeared to be paying attention. Some low-level awareness operating underneath everything else, and turned without visible surprise. They stood at the edge of the crater together for a moment, looking at it. "It's a good treaty," he said. "Kessler's work. The concept was yours." He looked at her sidelong. The hard deck landing was a Terran idea, telling us to come, agreeing to be demonstrated to in the first place. That was a choice you made. "I made it for the wrong reasons," she said. "I made it because I intended to say no and wanted the refusal to be public. People make good decisions for wrong reasons all the time," he said. "The decision's still good." She looked at the crater, at the 4-meter circle of fractured stone that had been the beginning of a very long day. And that was now, by her instruction, a permanent feature of a hall that would otherwise have been restored to show no evidence that the day had occurred at all. "When you leave," she said. "When the fleet eventually draws down to its permanent garrison configuration, will you be among the personnel who stay?" He was quiet for a moment. "Probably not," he said. "This will be a fixed garrison posting." "I'm not good at fixed." He shifted his weight on the cane. "A small adjustment. I'll be somewhere else." "There are usually a lot of somewhere elses." "I thought as much." "Kessler will stay," he said, "or someone very similar to Kessler. And the garrison commander will be competent. Someone who knows what they're doing." "Someone who knows what they're doing," she repeated. "But not you." "Not me." She nodded. She had expected this answer. She had asked the question anyway, for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself, and she found she was glad she'd asked it. "Then I'll say this now," she said. He looked at her. "What you said in the medical bay about standing at the door, about being the thing in the dark so the lit part stays lit, She kept her voice even and looked at the crater rather than at him, because it was easier to say directly what needed saying when you weren't looking at the person you were saying it to. I want you to know that I heard it, not the diplomatic version of heard, where you receive information and file it appropriately. I actually heard it. She paused. I've been thinking about it for 10 days, and I expect I'll think about it for considerably longer. He didn't answer immediately. I also want you to know, she said, that the hall will stay this way. Not for the political symbolism of it, though there is that. Because it happened, and it should be visible that it happened and visible what it cost. She finally looked at him. Your door gets a marker. That seemed worth saying. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that had seen, by her estimate, considerably more than eyes should reasonably have to see. Then he looked at the crater, at the marker that already existed, in the form of fractured stone and scorch marks and the compressed record of a gunship under an environmental seal. Thank you, he said, not qualified. Not surrounded by the usual careful architecture of someone who doesn't quite know what to do with sincerity. Just that. Plainly the way he did most things. She reached out and placed her hand over his right hand, over the scarred knuckles and the calluses and the accumulated physical history of a life conducted in close proximity to hard things. She held it there for a moment. His hand was still under hers, not pulling away, not moving. Take care of yourself. Liam, she said. A pause. Small enough that it could have been nothing. Large enough that it wasn't. Doing my best. Ma'am, he said. She took her hand back. She straightened. She looked up at the cruisers moving slow and enormous across the afternoon sky, casting their long industrial shadows over the capital. And she thought, yes, this is what it is. This is what safety actually looks like when you stop requiring it to be beautiful. She turned and walked back toward the gallery entrance. Her remaining guard falling in around her with the slightly awkward weight distribution of people learning a new way of moving in unfamiliar equipment. She didn't look back. Behind her, she heard the sound of the shuttle ramp descending, then the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man with a cane and a splinted arm making his way across cracked stone without hurrying, then the ramp ascending again, and the hiss of the pressure seal, and the ignition of the engine's chemical propellant, loud and unsubtle. The kind of sound that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. The shuttle rose. She didn't turn to watch it. She knew it was rising because the sound changed, gaining distance, and then the boom of it breaking through the cloud layer. And then nothing but the ambient noise of a city that was still partly on fire and still being itself anyway. She walked through the gallery entrance and into the corridor beyond and stood there for a moment alone, before her staff would catch up. With the treaty signed and the fleet overhead and the hall behind her, exactly as damaged as it had always been since the day everything changed. The universe is a cold place. She had known this in the abstract, the way you know things that your life has not yet required you to know concretely. She knew it now differently as a material fact, as the kind of knowledge that sits in the body rather than the mind. That changes the angle of how you stand and what you look at when you look at the sky. The universe is cold and it does not resolve itself into something warmer on request. And sometimes the only thing between a civilization and the dark is a person who is willing to go and stand in the part that's dark and hold the line there. Ugly and unelegant and entirely unbothered by what that looks like from inside the light. 3,000 years. She had spent 3,000 years of accumulated civilization producing art and philosophy and architecture and refinement and the long, careful project of becoming something that the universe had not intended her species to be. She was proud of it. She intended to keep doing it. She intended to do it harder and better now that she understood what it cost. But she would not forget, again, what was holding the door. She walked on down the corridor and didn't look back at the sky, because the cruisers were there whether she looked at them or not. And that was the whole point.